Then occurs to me somewhere. It's a serious problem. It's a serious problem we have, not just in terms of assumption of other countries. You all have to ignore the papers going around on the walls. Goes with none of us having to be in on Patty's Day. None of us having to be in on Patty's Day, and it's an economic concept, of course. Sell it first. A lot of historical actors and a lot of real people have a very narrow frame of reference. For the people that we looked at, witness statements and the census, they operate within a particular frame of reference. If you get a chance tomorrow evening to go to a lecture which is given by Professor Lee, this will be important. Within a particular frame of reference, what shape that frame of reference? So when we find that they were members of the Canadian League, members of the field, which we in Ireland tend to think of peculiarly only in the context. But of course, it's also part of a wider frame of reference of Europe in the years coming up to the First World War. In that frame of reference, a wide range of things were happening. There was a growing willingness, both by conservative political elites, not just Irish nationalists, suffragettes, syndicalists, the trade union, sort of political. Which comes up from Achilles. So let me just take these in order. So I'll look at that in a minute. Okay, So it's 4:minutes, and it's the day before Patrick's Day, and I'm obviously not in college, and most of the class are not in college or on campus. I understand from the tweets this morning that in one final year class, out of 200 students taking the course, there was only 11 in the lecture hall. And one of the students who tweeted this was very upset that nobody was turning up. But given that it's a Monday between the weekend and a holiday, it makes a certain amount of sense. I can understand it. And that's one of the reasons why we're building up towards having this session on a Google Hangout. And there's at least one other person has already gotten in there. I see there's one other person viewing the Hangout, and no doubt more people will come in. And as they do, there'll be a number of things that we can do. I will keep an eye on the Twitter stream for people who are not in the Hangout. So anyone who tweets on that hashtag, I will pick that up and we will see it. And in the meantime, what I want to do is look at the discussion that we had this week about the articles by the review of Time on the Cross, the review of IBM and the Holocaust, and to a lesser extent, the meeting about Electronic Arts and how they develop numerical ratings for player performances in their NFL game. And they're obviously very interesting pieces. IBM and the Holocaust obviously makes this argument about the relationship between computer technology or pre-digital computer technology, the punch card technology, and the Holocaust and the nature of modernity. There's an argument there that the Holocaust is in itself a very modern event, in that modern technologies and modern tools were necessary for it to happen. And there's a question there about the morality of the use of that information. And a number of issues come up in the discussion about ethics and morality and the use of information, and maybe the differences between legal and historical standards of proof in terms of responsibility. And the other substantive reading we had was a review of Fogel and Engerman's Time on the Cross, where they used detailed econometric analysis driven on a computer and only possible by computerization to analyze records on slavery in the American South. And they produced a very counterfactual analysis where they argued that slavery was not as bad as the conventional interpretation, and that challenged people's conventional understanding of the nature of the thing. So those in themselves were very challenging interpretations and counter-interpretations of what went on. In the discussion and in the readings, Danielle certainly came out batting this week in defense of economics and the econometricians and economics as a science, and brought up a number of very interesting points. One of those, of course, is the whole question of defending economic analysis as a valid way of looking at a problem and as a valid lens for concerning oneself or for looking at historical data, as well as just reading the text. There are other ways to do it. And economics and econometric analysis is one of them. And of course, given that so few historians are skilled in it, it's one that produces a great deal of hostility. She did also make the point about people's subjective approaches to the past and the stereotypical way they approach things, and the imposition of today's standards on events in the past. Forgive the dog, he's excited. So that's an important issue. It's a constant issue in history, and it's not just an issue in history in terms of how we impose contemporary standards on the past, but also how we impose our own standards here in a nice, comfortable little Western liberal democracy on the rest of the world. We're very surprised when the rest of the world doesn't share them, but it does color how we interpret evidence and information, both of the past and of contemporary events. But what really got my attention further down the discussion was the introduction of the concept of self-interest, which has a particular meaning in economics, and it doesn't necessarily mean selfish and greedy. It does mean acting in your own best self-interests. And it ties into the illegible marginal note that I have there, is the concept of bounded rationality. It ties into this question of bounded rationality in decision-making and frames of reference. historical actors act in a way that makes sense in the frame of reference that they're living in. So the decisions made at the time of the French Revolution, for example, reflect the frame of reference of the nobility, the monarchy, people like that, what they had grown up understanding as being possible, what they did not accept as being possible, and how that shaped their decisions. That's not exactly the same as the concept of self-interest in the hidden hand of profit in economics, but it does, the relationship between the two is, what is the frame of reference? What is the historical context that these people understand their actions being limited by? What is their understanding of the limits of the possible? And so, for example, when we looked at the witness statements and we looked at the census returns earlier in the course, we were looking at people growing up between 1900 and 1918, 1919 in Ireland, in a context where there were certain things happening. So things like, for instance, their prior membership of the Gaelic League was evidence of their involvement with language nationalism prior to the First World War, and that was part of their frame of reference. They're also part of a frame of reference of Europe in the same period, where there's an increasing rise of militarism, where there's increasing romantic nationalism, increasing belief by conservative elites that they needed to resort to force to maintain order, and an increasing willingness by those in opposition, not just nationalists, but also the suffragettes, radical trade union movement, all sorts of groups like that, that it was necessary to resort to force in order to achieve their political aims. So that's the frame of reference. That frame of reference is perhaps a little harder for us to understand now where we are in 2015. It does, for instance, inform and has to inform our understanding of how we commemorate the 1916 Rising. And certainly if you're free on Thursday evening, Professor Joe Lee is giving the Dermot Whelan lecture on this very subject, the commemoration of 1916 and how we might approach it. So there's this question here of self-interest and bounded rationality, and what you understand the possibilities of action open to you are. And what we have to do as historians in interpreting the past is we have to be aware not just of our frame of reference, but of the frame of reference of people at the time. I guess one of the ways to read this idea that history is a dialogue between the present and the past is that part of the dialogue is between our frame of reference now, or our understanding of what should be possible, and the frame of reference that people in the past had for what should have been possible. So that concept of self-interest opens up a whole realm of discussion about frames of reference and possibilities and human action and human choices, which is really important and very interesting. There's also, of course, the question of ethics. There's the question of numerical data. There's the question of who you blame, how we now blame people in the past for acting differently. The question of research ethics and the ethical use of information about the past. And this question of mentality, which slides in there at the end of Jack's post, where he talks about the difference between predictability and reducing things to predictable numbers versus how you cannot, capture the essence of a person. In this case, he takes the example of Paul O'Connell after the weekend that was in it. That didn't work out as well as we'd hoped to on the rugby pitch, but the point that's made here, that you can reduce certain things to numbers and evidence and text, but all of this is simply pointers to what's going on in the mind of the person. And the real challenge for a historian is to get into that mindset, that mentalite, to use the French version of the word, a word which crops up in historical writing as mentalité. The history of mentalités, the history of mindsets. So it's an important distinction between what you can nail down as evidence and what lies beyond the evidence. And then Kiri brings up this tweet by Justine Sacco, which is relevant as a digital thing, but it's also very relevant for those of you who don't know the story. She tweeted, this was an American PR person. She was going on holiday to South Africa, and Kiri quotes the tweet just as she was getting on the plane. She tweeted, "Going to Africa, Hope I don't get AIDS. Just kidding, I'm white. And it was an extraordinarily insensitive thing for someone who was a PR professional to tweet. And while she was in the flight, this became the #1 trending tweet in the world, and loads of people leapt on it to attack her. It ended her career. Her employer, she lost her job, and a whole lot of other consequences followed on from it. But it raises two interesting things. One is how that piece of evidence gives us an insight into the mindset of people in, it was like December 2014 that tweet happened. It shows that there were still people in December 2014 who could tweet something like that and think it was funny. It also shows that there were hundreds of thousands of people who would react on Twitter very, very strongly in opposition to that. And that would have consequences. So that little tweet, the discussion about what does that mean, and the reaction to it as a piece of historical evidence is interesting in terms of, and one of the things we have to be able to do. It's all very well, we love history, we're learning it, it's fun, but you got to go out there in the real world and get a job. You have to be able to explain how and why it is that you as a historian possess the skills to take a piece of evidence and tease out the consequences of that piece of evidence and say, well, what does this mean? What light does it shed or other things? What additional questions does it then raise that we can follow down by looking at the data in terms of, who responded to this tweet? What was the demographics of the people who responded to this tweet in the various ways? What more can this tell us about the social and cultural history of the time? It also brings up another question about public and private spheres. That comes up farther down as well in the discussion. And Danielle's reply, I think, reminds me of this public and private, where our nature, and I'm pretty sure I have marked it farther down as well in the discussion about, yes, the nature, Sarah, something that Sarah said about the changing idea of privacy. That digital has changed our idea of privacy very fundamentally, and lots of commentators say, oh, it's destroyed privacy. But if you think about it, in France up to the Revolution, and in England up to the Regency, up to about the 1830s, the concept of privacy was much less well developed than it now is. The great houses were symbols of wealth and sort of open theaters of extensive, extravagant consumption. They were places for the rich and the noble and the powerful to show off their wealth and their power. And of course, that provoked a reaction. It contributed to the reaction of the French Revolution. Dangerous Liaisons captures that moment and what the public saw and how they reacted to it. It was based on a novel written before the Revolution. Victorian England sees the emergence of a much more defined private sphere. So we had this idea for 5 or 6 generations since the 1830s across most of the relatively prosperous English-speaking world, that there was a private sphere. You went in, you closed the door in the evening, it was not public. What you said in your house, what you wrote, what you tapped out on your computer keyboard in a private conversation was private. And you could express certain opinions there as long as you maintained a public facade of respectability. And what's happening now is that the digital is making a swing in the nature of our concepts of privacy. The note I have there was that in the past, not only was, for well-off people, ostentation was more important than privacy. They were like C-list celebrities these days. But if you lived in a small village, everybody knew what you were doing. It was a surveillance village. There wasn't much you could do that people didn't know about. In the cities, you had a certain degree of anonymity, and that's what made them different in the pre-modern world. And now what we've got is this situation where all over the world, you're subject to the same degree of scrutiny and surveillance as you used to be in a small town in the west of Ireland when you lived in the Valley of the Squinting Windows. So as historians, we need to be aware of the broader ebb and flow there, I think, and look at some interest at those and see what happens about them. This issue of privacy is important, and we can bring a longer perspective to it if we think about it. And what is acceptable public and private behavior, and how do we define new standards? And that also raises the question of evidence. how do we use evidence, what evidence can we legitimately use, and also the difference, which comes up in the Edwin Black book, between the standards of historical evidence, what's historical proof, and what's legally required proof. In Edwin Black's book, IBM and the Holocaust, for a historian, the evidence that IBM in New York profited from the use by the Nazis of their European subsidiaries' technology for counting people in the census is adequate for a historian. A historian would say, yes, IBM's European subsidiary leased this machinery to census bureaus. It was used by the Nazis. Profits from that use flowed back to IBM in New York. For a historian, that's a chain of responsibility. When it went to court, it did not satisfy the legal requirements for chain of evidence and chain of responsibility, and it certainly, of course, didn't satisfy the requirements for asserting that IBM's shareholders in the late 1990s and the early 2000s were responsible for the acts of their predecessors. So there are different ways and different standards that history and the law use in terms of deciding what's good enough to say, yes, this person was responsible for that. There's a sufficient chain of evidence there to suggest that in all probability, these people knew what was going on and were okay with it. And then the legal standards are much different. And that, of course, also raises a question where you have people making decisions about the use of mass observation materials to make political decisions, and decisions that have consequences on lives. Because most political figures have a pretty good reading knowledge of history and a sort of reasonably good layman's knowledge of the sort of standards of proof that will satisfy, common sense standards of proof that will satisfy historical analysis, but they don't necessarily grasp the legal standards of proof, and then they go off and make decisions about drone strikes and stuff, which have serious consequences for people. So there is an issue there about the nature of knowledge and proof. There's also, of course, a question, one of the last things that I've marked here in the discussion, about the use of, and again, it's in response, I think, by Sarah, in response to something Danielle said about the need to use different methodologies together. The value of econometrics when considered with other historical sources or other historical methods. In research terms, you might call this triangulation, using several different research methods and several different types of evidence to arrive at an understanding of the issue at hand. So economic history is one. In the census, you can look at occupation, standard of living, you get an insight into quality of people's lives. In the witness statements, you get a more political statement and a more traditional battles and dates thing. Most of the witness statements don't give much insight into cultural history or people's mindset. They simply tell you what people did. You have to look to the broader cultural history to try and locate those two sources in a broader cultural context and understand what people's beliefs were about economics coming up to the First World War and the War of Independence, and why there was an economic motivation there, and what people's understanding of culture and national identity was, and how that led them to making certain choices about whether they would or would not join the volunteers and resort to and participate in the campaign from 1919 to 1921. In some of the witness statements, the ones that are more explicit about their political motivation or ideology are the ones from people who went on to fight on the Republican side in the Civil War, because some of them felt the need subsequently to justify at greater length the choice they'd made. So some of those do give you some insight into that. So this question of using mixed methods is important. History is one of the few disciplines that does that. Has always done it long before other disciplines began to think that they should not just focus on one type of evidence. So I think those are some of the interesting points. I have another one here. It's down at the end. In one of Danielle's posts, talking again about proof and evidence, and the one marginal note I have, of course, is it evokes for me Minority Report, the Tom Cruise film, where on the basis of observation of behavior, someone could be held guilty of thinking about committing a murder before they even did it. And for me, that goes back to a very famous set of books by Isaac Asimov, the Foundation trilogy. I don't know if you've ever read it. The first one is worth a read, even if you're not into science fiction, because in the whole series, the premise is that far, far away in the future, in a far distant galaxy, a mathematician and historian, the profession that he claims to be is psychohistorian, has perfected the art of predicting human behavior in the mass so accurately that he can predict when the enormous galactic empire will fall and how this will plunge the galaxy into 10,000 years of barbarian darkness. And also part of the premise is that he has predicted, or he has identified, ways in which that dark age can be shortened, so he can shorten it, so he can manage the future. That's an enormously appealing conceit, actually. But at the time the Foundation trilogy was written, quite a long time ago now, certainly the Western world had a very strong belief in technocratic economic management. And the Foundation trilogy, particularly the second book, was very much a critique of that. So in the first book, he lays out this really compelling argument about mathematically predicting historical behavior into the future. And then in the second book, he proceeds to blow a huge hole in it, which makes it very interesting reading indeed. Let me, I haven't set this to refresh automatically, bring that up there and see if anybody's come on board. And not, in fact, and let me drop back out to this and see, still only one viewer. That's okay. People can pick it up on YouTube and we'll get the benefits of it anyway, and can react subsequently to some of the stuff that's come up here, which I think are broader issues in terms of frames of reference, using different types of evidence, the nature of public and private space, and that ties into the way in which we analyze things as well, which is kind of, a lot of these feed into the final topic that we're going to discuss based on Matthew Jocker's chapter on close and distant reading, which we're going to look at in about 2 weeks' time. But what we're going to look at for next week, let me go back to the content. This discussion that we've had, there's a few people who have contributed quite a lot, and that's great. There's some other people who need to get in there and catch up, because I think this is an interesting discussion. So discussions don't end just because we've had the week and we've discussed them in the Hangout. This can carry on and you can feed back into it over the course of the next week. I was tempted to drop this topic out in order to facilitate carrying on this discussion, but it really is interesting. Particularly the questions about these two projects about prosography, which is about creating databases which allow you to track life events across a large number of people. And so there's issues there about practicality, which are important. And there's also a question in the other article, in the design, where I think the design could be improved on, and where I'm suggesting that you should look at those in terms of how you could, what lessons about practical organization of a database-based historical research project you can take from it, and how you can improve on the design. Whether you see scope for improving on the design in Thornton's article about the Celtic Kings, which is a source, early medieval Ireland, that some of you will have some nodding acquaintance with. So pick up on that in a low-key way. But if you haven't already participated in the discussion on controversy and the use and abuse of stats, go right ahead and add into it, because it will feed in. A lot of those will come back in when we look at data and historical narrative and how the two relate in our final session. So that's how those will go, and that's the run of things. So do, as I say, read through the stuff here for those of you that haven't posted. Pick up some of the points maybe I've raised here and weave them into that thread of discussion, which will feed into this. And in the meantime, when you get a chance, do these readings and look in a very limited way at these questions. Don't give these articles more than an hour each. So, give this about maybe 3 or 4 hours work. Keep it tight to that. But certainly with this, because it links to this, you can sort of give yourself lots of thinking time and let that flow work out. And in the meantime, I will close this off and I will put the link to the YouTube video up. And next week, we will meet online again. I may actually do the Hangout from Western Gateway Geo4 so that people who want to come along and be in the room at the time, we can have a mix of online and live action and see how that works out over the next 2 weeks. And certainly I'm in my office Mondays and Tuesdays going forward from here to the end of term for people who need to arrange to drop up for a chat about finishing off the portfolio. So I think, let me just have a look at the Twitter machine. And if there's nobody on Twitter, let's just refresh that. Our Twitter wall's a little quiet. Fair enough. But rather than pushing the length of this out and making it too big to stream on people's home internet connections, we'll just call it a day at that. And I may see some of you face-to-face next Monday at 4 o'clock in Western Gateway, and some of you online to talk about those readings on prosography.